This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on post-World War II wars and non-state terrorism. So right after World War II, the big conflict in the world was the Cold War, and some major points about the Cold War context. The three regions that the Cold War impacted were something known as a bipolar war, so the two major powers of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, the US representing capitalist democratic nations, the Soviet Union representing communist nations. Another big conflict that would take place was between Western and Eastern Europe, and the constant fear that the Soviet Union was going to be invading into Western Europe. And then the biggest region that really got impacted by the Cold War were the developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The first president, when the Cold War took place, was President Harry Truman, and he feared that Europe might turn to communism because of the economic devastation coming out of World War II. The theory at that time was that if the economy got bad enough in Europe and there was enough poverty, Europeans would vote in, if not accept, an invasion of communism in order to solve their problems. Remember, coming out of the Great Depression with World War II, that this was the big belief. If the economy goes badly, people turn towards radical forms of government. So he initiated two main policies in order to deal with this. On the military side, he initiated something called containment, or what was known as an encircling of the Soviet Union, putting bases in Western Europe in order to encircle the Soviet Union and keep them contained to a particular part of the world. The second part was economic, was to redevelop Europe, and this was done under the Marshall Plan, where the United States gave economic aid to European countries in order to develop their industry and then participate in international trade. So let's talk about U.S. military policy first. The U.S. used containment, like we talked about, to encircle the Soviet Union. The idea of containment was devised by George F. Kennan. Kennan wrote a long letter called the Long Telegram, which was sent to President Truman. He was the ambassador to the Soviet Union, and he made the argument that the best way to deal with the Soviet Union was to contain them by encircling them with bases in Western Europe. Along with that, by 1949, the U.S. established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the idea there was that European nations would join together with the United States under the promise that if the Soviet Union should ever invade one country, all these countries would join together and stop the Soviet Union. The point here was not to invade, but rather to create deterrence. Similar type of idea was formed in the 1950s with SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, in which the countries of Southeast Asia promised that they would stop any attempt by China to invade within their countries. The Truman Doctrine also was a military doctrine which gave money to aid anti-communist groups in Turkey and Greece. Now, the interesting thing about this to keep in mind is that the idea was that there were these anti-communist groups in Turkey and Greece who were trying to take over, and they were probably aligning with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Actually, we now know that wasn't the case. In Turkey and Greece, there were anti-communist groups, but they were not aligned with Joseph Stalin. In fact, Stalin didn't want to get involved in what was happening in Turkey and Greece because he feared if he did so, he might initiate a United States attack on the Soviet Union. Now, this eventually leads up to one of the big problems in the Cold War, and it's a constant paranoia between both sides. And a good example of this is with the Berlin blockade. The United States and Russia at the end of World War II had agreed to split up Germany into Eastern and Western Germany. The capital of Germany was in Berlin, which is entirely located in the northern eastern side of Germany. So that means it's entirely within the communist section of Germany. This too ended up being split in a very similar way between East and West. East was communist, West was connected to Western Germany, and it was capitalist and democratic. At one point, the United States tried to reunite all of Western Germany. Western Germany itself had been split up between the three powers, Britain, France, and the United States. The U.S. tried in 1947 to reunite all of these sections together under one currency and one government. The attempt to do this by the United States was really to try and create a strong Western Germany that could participate in international trade. However, we never communicated this with Joseph Stalin. So Stalin perceived this as an attempt to invade. Now, why would Stalin perceive this? Well, if you look at Russian history, it actually makes kind of sense. For Joseph Stalin, Russian history is a demonstration time and time again of being invaded by outside powers, whether that was Napoleon in the late 1700s, or if that was Japan in 1906, with their naval destruction of the Russian Navy, or again with Germany in World War II when Hitler broke his promises. So for Stalin, Russian history is constantly a history of paranoia about being invaded. So when he saw the U.S. reunite Western Germany and there was no communication as to why we were doing this, he believed it was an attempt to invade. So Stalin blockaded Western Berlin, and Truman's reaction to this was to airlift materials to Western Berlin for a year. And after that year, Stalin acceded at that point and gave up on doing this. But what this demonstrates is this paranoia. On the Russian side, the paranoia was about a possible U.S. invasion, which was not happening. And on the American side, the constant paranoia was that Joseph Stalin was getting ready to invade, which really was not going to happen either. And in 1949, the tensions really escalate. In 1949, China fell to communism under Mao Zedong, which meant that at that point, both Russia and China, two of the largest population centers in the world, had fallen to communism. 1/3 of the population of the world now was under communism. The USSR successfully tested its first atomic bomb, and the U.S. found atomic spies. They had given these materials to the Soviets that allowed for the testing of the atomic bomb. Most U.S. policymakers believed that while the Soviet Union would eventually get an atomic bomb, it wouldn't happen until the late 1950s because the Soviet Union's economy and scientific abilities just were not that strong at the time. So when this happened in 1949, it was a shock. And then it was found out the reason why was that there were some atomic spies. They had given over information to the Soviets. On top of all of this, in the midst of all these problems, North Korea invades South Korea and attempts to reunite the peninsula under communism. And that leads us into this next major conflict that takes place. Now, North Korea and South Korea had been split right after World War II. The Russians and the Americans had invaded together, and they decided to split the two apart. The North Koreans, by 1949, approached Joseph Stalin and asked for support because they wanted to reunite the peninsula, but under their system of governance. Joseph Stalin originally agreed to this, believing that there was no way Harry Truman would take a risk of World War III over a small peninsula in Southeast Asia. However, Harry Truman saw this very differently. For Truman, the issue was the protection of Japan, a check on the growth of communism from China, and the need to keep open trade within this region of the world. So Truman went to the United Nations and built a coalition to stop the North Koreans. At this point, Joseph Stalin feared a possible World War III conflict, and he exited the war as quickly as possible. And actually, this allowed the Americans to have a good degree of success within the Korean War. Douglas MacArthur led the attack on North Korea, and he did a very risky, what was called an amphibious attack, in which he had the bulk of the United States forces attacking from the western side of South Korea, while on the opposite side, a smaller group of U.S. forces came in through waterways and attacked in order to sandwich the North Koreans, and it worked. They caught them by surprise, pushed them up above what was called the 38th parallel, and started pushing them to North Korea. It's almost succeeded, except Douglas MacArthur made a huge mistake. As he got closer and closer to the tip of North Korea, he was warned to allow the Koreans to take the lead, because if they didn't, the Chinese might enter into the war out of fear that Americans were going to invade China. Douglas MacArthur believed this was a bad idea, that the South Koreans were not ready to take on the North Koreans, and so he took the lead, and as he got closer to the Yalu River, the Chinese entered into the war, and they overwhelmed the Americans, not because they had a superior military. In fact, far more Chinese people died than Americans during this war, but the Chinese had so many people that they could overwhelm the Americans with troops, and by the time the war was over, we basically ended off where we started, at the 38th parallel, with North Korea being communist and South Korea being allied to the United States. So in the 1950s, President Eisenhower came in and he criticized containment. A lot of Americans don't know this because we're so used to containment that we forget that there were differing belief systems on how to deal with communism. Truman's idea was to contain. Eisenhower called this immoral. He said that really what we need to do was to liberate and to roll back the communists in China and in Russia. So his idea to roll back was to do the following. First, for a decade, he believed that we could undermine potential allies of the Soviet Union and then weaken them. And then once we did that, the Soviet Union would be so weak it couldn't get outside resources that then we could invade by the end of the decade. And this happened on a number of different occasions. The three big cases I want you to remember are Guatemala, where we toppled a socialist government that had been elected peacefully. The leader of that government was Jacobo Arbenz. We also toppled a socialist government in Iran, led by Mohammad Mossadegh, again, elected peacefully into power. And we toppled a socialist government in the Congo, led by a man named Patrice Lumumba. In each one of these cases, these men were elected into power peacefully by the people as an attempt to try and create their own independence. We assumed that they were connected to communism and that we needed to overthrow them in the hopes that by doing that we would weaken the Soviet Union and then eventually invade. In the 1960s, John F. Kennedy came into power, and he saw some of the problems with Eisenhower's overall desire to roll back. He believed that this was too much of an idealistic notion that we couldn't fulfill and risked the possibility of World War III. So he called instead for a case-by-case basis, or what he called flexible response. We'd have to look at each case and decide which ones we wanted to intervene in and which ones not to. At the time, he had inherited an attempt to do something like this. Eisenhower had given to him an operation that was being planned called Operation Mongoose. Most people know this as the Bay of Pigs incident, in which we trained Cubans who had left the island to come back to the island and to attack at the Bay of Pigs, and then we would use our Air Force to support them. We would catch Fidel Castro off guard, and then the people of Cuba would join up with us and we would overthrow Fidel Castro's regime. Instead, Fidel Castro found out what was happening. Somehow secretly he was able to find out. He imprisoned anybody who was his opponents. He surrounded the refugees who showed up at the Bay of Pigs, and JFK pulled out from providing Air Force at the last minute, fearing a possible World War III. This led to a severe questioning of JFK's leadership. In fact, the president of Russia, President Khrushchev, saw an opportunity. He believed that at this point, Kennedy was so young and so weak, he could place missiles in Cuba. In response, Kennedy established a blockade of the island, and within a period of about 13 days, we came incredibly close to a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. But at the very last minute, Kennedy was able to resolve this issue, and at the end of that resolution, Kennedy came across as a hero to the world. On the opposite side, in the Soviet Union, the communists who were in charge saw this as a massive loss. They took Khrushchev out of power, they put him under lifetime imprisonment, and he essentially became not only a non-citizen of Russia, but a non-human of Russia. And at that point, we saw much more stringent communists come into power. It just happened that when that happened, we were going through probably our biggest crisis and conflict in the United States, and that had to deal with Vietnam. In Vietnam, the leader of North Vietnam was a man named Ho Chi Minh, and Ho Chi Minh had been leading an independence movement for North Vietnam since the beginning of the century. The group that he was fighting against were the French, and during World War II, he would fight against the Japanese as well. In 1955, the French lost their colony because Ho Chi Minh's movement was able to surround them at the fort called Dien Bien Phu. America decided, though, not to allow this to go away. They feared that if Vietnam became communist, that might lead to what they call the domino theory effect, in which China becomes communist in Vietnam, then more and more countries just topple to communism. So America entered and tried to maintain a distinction between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North being communist, South Vietnam being an ally to the United States. Sounds a lot like Korea. The U.S. ended up, though, accidentally, well, not accidentally, but the U.S. ended up in poor management supporting a corrupt regime in South Vietnam named Ngo Diem. Ngo Diem was an American Vietnamese individual who went back to Vietnam. He had been trained here in education. And when he went back, he began a land redistribution policy, which sounded like a good idea. Redistribute out land to numerous different people so that there could be more competition in South Vietnam. Instead, he basically did this through what is known as crony capitalism, in which he was giving away land to his friends, especially friends who were in the military at the time. Then Ngo Diem made an even bigger mistake. Ngo Diem started closing down Buddhist temples because he was Catholic in the hopes that he could enforce Catholicism on the country. This led to a massive protest in which Buddhists came out and protested nonviolently. One of the Buddhists, as he was protesting, actually had somebody light him on fire. And this was captured in the national media and showed how corrupt the Ngo Diem regime was. By 1964, President Johnson, after Kennedy, escalated troops in the hopes of trying to defeat North Vietnam, and he did so under an incident called the Gulf of Tonkin, in which supposedly 2 American battleships had been attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats. The U.S. then began bombing North Vietnam. We did not put troops into North Vietnam because our fear was we would do the same mistake we did in North Korea. We didn't want to get close to China and then get China involved in the war. In fact, we bombed North Vietnam so much, we bombed them more than all the countries we bombed combined in World War II. The U.S. also used something called napalm, which was an attempt to get rid of the forested region and find out where communists were hiding. Unfortunately, what ended up happening was U.S. napalm often ended up destroying Vietnamese villages because it was hard to make distinctions using that kind of a weapon. Then all of a sudden, Gulf of Tonkin was found out to be false. One of the American battleships actually had not really been attacked. It was a weather incident that had been on radar and came out the wrong way. Another ship had been attacked, but the attack was so minimal that the captain of the ship literally found out about the attack by walking out on the deck and just finding a few cartridges from the bullets that had been fired onto the deck. When Americans found out about this, they felt that they had been lied to, and there was what was called a credibility gap between the American government and the public. Then, on top of all of this, in 1972, a story came out that during 1968 there had been a massacre of a Vietnamese village at a place called My Lai. And when that was exposed, it was also turned out that the American military tried to cover it up. This was exposed by Seymour Hersh, and it came out at the same time that all this information was coming out. Americans felt lied to, and they felt that there was a credibility gap and a lack of trust between us and the American government. So that, in the Cold War context, we start to see the development of a whole new problem that we are now obviously dealing with today, and that's the beginnings of Islamic terrorism. So the Cold War ends in 1991. What we didn't realize at the time was that there was a much bigger problem that was brewing underneath the surface, and that had to deal with Islamic terrorism. So where does this problem come from? The Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, and when it did, the Europeans came into the Middle East and they carved it up under what's known as the Mandate System. In this system, Britain got a place that they called Palestine, Iran, and Jordan. France got Syria and Lebanon. The Jewish people at the time had been leading a movement called Zionism, and they saw a possibility to finally attain this goal. The idea of Zionism was to return to the area of the Holy Land to establish a nation-state for themselves. And the British even promised the Jews that they would help them in this, in something called the Balfour Declaration. But then, later on, they retracted this, and they began going back and forth. The British would promise the Muslims, Arab Muslims, certain gains, and they would promise the Jews certain gains, and this actually created conflict between the two groups. As this was taking place, something else was taking place as well in the Islamic community called Wahhabism. Back in the 14th century, a Islamic scholar named Tamiya had written for a more pure form of Islam. And then Abd al-Wahhab, an Islamic writer, picked that up in the late 1800s. He followed Tamiya, and he argued that the Islamic people really were losing out in the Ottoman Empire because of corruption. He criticized the use of tobacco, alcohol, and an openness to what he considered to be pagan philosophy or Greek philosophy. So he started calling for what was called tafiri, which was calling fellow Muslims who did not have a pure sense of Islam apostate. Ibn Saud. Abd al-Wahhab was eventually kicked out of his village, but there was a leader of the tribes in Saudi Arabia, a man named Ibn Saud, who saw a possibility with Wahhab. Not only did he agree with Wahhab's theology, he also saw the ability that this might be able to make strength for his royal family. So they formed an alliance with like-minded Muslims, and they began attacking who they considered to be sort of apostates, the Shiites. They massacred them in Karbala in Iraq. The Ottomans finally saw the danger, and they attacked the Wahhabis in 1812 and got rid of them. But the notion of Wahhabism never really left from this area. When the Ottomans collapsed, Abd al-Aziz united the Bedouins, the tribes at that time, under the message of Wahhab, and used this to then unite all of Saudi Arabia. However, he then feared the power of the Wahhabis, and he massacred them. But he used the message of Wahhabism in order to control the private lives of people in Saudi Arabia. So notice what's happening here. The Wahhabis themselves never really came into power, but the leaders of the area saw this idea of a pure theological church and state combined together as a possible way to control Saudi Arabia. Strangely enough, though, and this is what makes this so complicated, Abd al-Aziz went against this theology. He began opening up Saudi Arabia oil to Britain and the United States. Now, I know this gets very complicated with all these different people going back and forth, but here's what I want you to see out of this that's so important. The idea of Wahhabism was pure Islam, really going back to the text, the Quran, and following it literally. What we see happening is people using that to gain power, but then opening themselves up again to economic interests to the West. So amidst all this religious fight, a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser became leader of Egypt, and he led a coup against the king of Egypt. He nationalized the Suez Canal and took it back from Great Britain. This was a huge win for Gamal Abdel Nasser, and many people within the Arab countries saw this as a possibility for future success. And Gamal Abdel Nasser was able to call for a pan-Arab movement. Now, Gamal Abdel Nasser was not religious. He was secular. He called for a socialist government, Arab unity, and the eventual destruction of Israel. And eventually he fought against Israel in the Six-Day War in 1968 and lost. The reason why this becomes important is this. Now, this makes things very complicated, but the reason why it's important is Wahhabism, as a religious movement, was not as of yet in power. There was a possibility for a secular movement under Gamal Abdel Nasser. When Nasser failed, it started to open up the possibility for an alternative religious movement. Sayyid Qutb saw that possibility. He began observing the changes in Saudi Arabia towards oil markets. And he saw Gamal Abdel Nasser as being somebody who failed against Israel. He concluded the problem was with what he called apostate Islam, meaning that he believed that Islam was developing too much of an acceptance of Western values. In fact, at one point he came to the United States and he criticized the U.S. as having a liberal culture of sexual promiscuity, alcoholism, modern values. He also, by the way, expressed a good deal of racism as well. For example, he went to jazz concerts and talked about how America was willing to mix together with African Americans in this kind of what he considered to be degenerate music. He concluded that Western secular culture invaded Arab and Muslim purity. And this led to the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1973, Egypt lost another war to Israel called the Yom Kippur War. And then in 1980, Anwar Sadat made an agreement with Israel to end Egyptian invasions. Muslim nations tried to respond to this with an organization called OPEC. OPEC is known as the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They created higher prices on the worldwide oil by cutting back on oil production. The Muslim Brotherhood was formed to pursue a more pure form of Islam, and they saw these economic plays back and forth as being against the pure form of Islam. So, after Anwar Sadat made an agreement not to invade Israel anymore, they assassinated him. And this leads into an intensification of what we've been seeing rising here as far as terrorism goes. Once Anwar Sadat was assassinated and Egypt lost its leadership role, that was the end of the secular movement within the Middle East. And there was a return now to this purity of religion. And we see that in 1980. In 1980, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and Muslims in the area reacted by creating called the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors. They fought against the communists, who they saw as being atheistic. And at the time, the U.S. funded the Mujahideen because we believed that they would be a good bulwark against the Soviet Union. And it worked. Over the next 8 years, the Soviet Union was bankrupted by trying to fight against the Mujahideen. The problem was it led to several different splinter groups within the Mujahideen. In fact, you may have heard of the conspiracy theory that the CIA funded Osama Bin Laden in the 1980s when he was in Afghanistan. And to a certain extent, that is actually true. But it's not true in the way the conspiracy theory says. The conspiracy theory is that we wanted to create Osama Bin Laden. That was not really true. What we did was we were funding the Mujahideen, and accidentally by doing that, we ended up funding some of the more radical sects, and one of them was led by Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden came from an upper-class oil family in Saudi Arabia, and he had lost his faith in the Saudi Arabian government because he, like the Wahhabis, saw the problem of oil corruption. And so he turned to Sunni Wahhabism and Qutb. He criticized the U.S. for invading the holy lands of Islam in Mecca. And in 1991, when the U.S. went into these areas in order to stop Iraq from invading Kuwait, he saw this as a complete violation of allowing these infidels from the West into the Holy Lands, and so he saw Saudi Arabia as just being completely corrupted. And so on 9/11, his organization that he had formed in the Afghanistan War, called Al-Qaeda, or the Base, became a new cross-boundary terrorist group. And that's what bin Laden's vision was really very different from previous terrorist groups. Previous terrorist groups were basically regional groups. He wanted to have a global terrorist group. And bin Laden's strategy was to create cells of these terrorists all around the world. And when I say cells, cells could be anywhere from 10 people to 5 people to 1 person. And basically they would know through signals that they were supposed to attack. And in this particular case, their desire was to attack the economic centers of the United States. And that way the U.S. would then be drawn into the Middle East, and then over time would be bankrupted like the Soviet Union. So what are some of the conclusions we can walk away from this from? Some possible ones are this. In post-World War II, the fight that we saw was over superpowers, over ideology and marketplaces, and that's the Soviet Union versus the United States. In the developing world, non-aligned states tried to really gain their independence, so they would play off of either side, the U.S. as the Soviet Union. But in the midst of this fight of the Cold War, a new purity movement arose, a religious terrorist group that saw the possibility of gaining their independence, but through religious purity and national identity. And today's ISIS movement is in many ways a product of that purity and nationalist movement that we've seen taking place.